I'd just like to make the point that we're very fortunate that His Majesty has allowed us to use Buckingham Palace for this event, and I need to say that.
The late spring light over Aldermore Castle had a particular quality on the afternoon of Princess Rosalind's 12th birthday, the kind of gold that makes even an ordinary room look like it belongs in a painting. The long gallery had been prepared with a precision that suggested someone had spent weeks worrying over every detail. The flowers arranged in low displays so they wouldn't block sightlines. The seating chart drafted by a private secretary who understood, with the instincts of a battlefield general, exactly which relatives needed to be kept at a diplomatic distance from one another. She arrived without fanfare, dressed simply, her silver hair pinned back in the severe style she'd worn since her own youth, and she carried with her a small case of dark green leather that nobody in the room recognized. She didn't linger by the door, making small talk. She found her spot near the head of the room, waited for the murmur of conversation to settle on its own, and began to speak before anyone had thought to introduce her. Rosalind stood beside her, golden-haired, wearing white, entirely unaware that her birthday party was about to become something else. She was old enough to sense that adults were looking at her differently than usual, and young enough not to understand why. Eleonora spoke without raising her voice, which somehow made the room quieter than shouting would have. She said she was here to give Rosalind something that belonged to her by right of spirit, if not yet by law. She said the girl standing beside her carried more of her late grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, than anyone in this family had been willing to admit out loud. Not her title, not her position in the succession. Her spirit, her refusal to look away from suffering, her habit of walking straight toward the hardest rooms in any hospital or shelter she visited, when easier, safer public appearances were available to her. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was a tiara that half the room recognized immediately, and the other half had only seen in old photographs, the Winterhall star. Last worn publicly by Queen Elizabeth herself, 22 years earlier, at a hospice opening that the tabloids of the day had called beneath a queen's dignity. Elizabeth had worn it anyway. The gasp that moved through the gallery had genuine astonishment in it. Someone's champagne glass clinked too hard against a table. Prince Tobias, Rosalind's father, went very still in the way people do when they're recalculating an entire afternoon in real time. And then Queen Marguerite, the king's second wife, stepmother to Tobias, a woman whose composure was usually so total that courtiers joked she'd been born wearing it, was on her feet before the applause had even properly started. Her voice, when it came, had none of the practiced warmth the public had come to associate with her. "This is completely inappropriate," she said. "That tiara does not belong to a child. It belongs in the vault, where it has been for 2 decades, and it will go back there tonight." The room's temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. Marguerite pressed further, her tone sharpening. She said the family needed to stop treating Elizabeth's memory as a shrine. She said constant remembrance wasn't healthy for anyone, least of all the children. She said, with a brittle little laugh that convinced no one, that some ghosts needed to be allowed to finally rest. Eleonora did not flinch. She had been waiting for exactly this reaction for 6 months. And something in the set of her shoulders suggested she'd known it was coming with the certainty of a woman reading a script she'd already memorized. She knelt slightly to Rosalind's level instead of responding to Marguerite at all. "Your grandmother would be proud of you today," she said. "That is the only thing that matters in this room." Marguerite hadn't finished. She turned to the king, expecting, perhaps, that decades of marriage would produce an ally in this moment. "Tell them," she said, "that this isn't how things are done in this family." The king said nothing at first. He looked at his granddaughter, standing very still in her white dress, with a 200-year-old tiara balanced awkwardly in her small hands. And something in his expression shifted, not quite agreement with Eleonora, not quite defense of his wife, but the particular stillness of a man realizing a decision had already been taken out of his hands by the time he'd noticed it happening. It wasn't a resolution. Everyone in the room understood that much. It was a postponement, dressed up as a decision. The kind royal families have been making for centuries whenever the alternative is airing something in public that can't later be taken back. But it was enough, for the moment, to let the room exhale. Outside the castle gates, a small crowd of well-wishers who'd gathered for a glimpse of the birthday celebration had no idea that the real story wasn't happening at the gates at all. It had been unfolding quietly for half a year in the kind of unremarkable places where the truth tends to hide: a groundskeeper's cottage, a solicitor's back office, a storage unit outside the capital that nobody had thought to ask about in a very long time. Part 2. The 6 months nobody saw Eleonora had not decided to hand over the Winterhall star on a whim. What looked, to the birthday guests, like a spontaneous act of family defiance was the final step of something she'd been building since the previous autumn, since the day she'd first noticed that the palace archive didn't add up. She had been cataloging old correspondence for an unrelated project, a biography commissioned by the Crown to mark what would have been Elizabeth's 60th birthday. It was tedious work, mostly dull administrative letters and shipping manifests for state visits, and it should have taken a few weeks. Instead, it took much longer, because the deeper she went, the more she found gaps where there should have been continuity. Entire folders referenced in a 2003 archival index simply weren't in the boxes anymore. A set of Elizabeth's private letters to her sons, cited in a footnote from a 2009 internal memo, had vanished sometime between then and now, with no transfer record, no note explaining where they'd gone. Photographs from Elizabeth's visits to refugee camps and children's hospitals, the ones the tabloids at the time had dismissed as stunts, were missing from folders that should have held them. Individually, any one of these gaps could be explained by ordinary carelessness. Archives are imperfect. Papers get misfiled. But taken together, spanning nearly 15 years, they formed something that didn't look like carelessness at all. It looked like a slow, patient erasure. At first she assumed it was her own mistake, a misfiled reference, an outdated index she was reading against the wrong year. She spent an entire weekend cross-checking against the original 1998 catalog, then the 2004 update, then the digitized version compiled a decade later. Each version told a slightly different story, and the differences weren't random. They tracked a slow, steady thinning, as though someone had gone through the archive on a regular schedule, removing a little more each time, confident that nobody would ever compare all three versions side by side. Nobody, it turned out, ever had until Eleonora, working late in a nearly empty records room with cold tea and a growing sense that she'd found something she wasn't meant to find. She began asking quiet questions of people who'd worked closely with Elizabeth. Most had retired. Some had passed away. One name kept surfacing: Simon Ashworth, who had served as Elizabeth's private valet for over a decade and had left royal service not long after her death. She found him living outside the capital, in his late 70s now, careful and slow-moving. The posture of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. He agreed to meet her at a small tea house on the condition that no one else knew, and he chose a table at the back, facing the door, out of a habit he'd apparently never quite shaken. He didn't speak for the first several minutes. He stirred his tea longer than it needed. When he finally began, his voice was low, almost apologetic, as though he were confessing something rather than simply remembering it. What he told her over the course of 2 long afternoons was not one incident, but a pattern. A slow, deliberate program of removing Elizabeth's personal effects from the archive, beginning quietly in the years after her divorce from the king and accelerating sharply after her death. Letters gathered up overnight in boxes that were never logged. Staff who'd been close to her reassigned to distant postings or encouraged into early retirement, with reasons that shifted depending on who was asking. A few had received calls making clear, without ever saying so outright, that their pensions and their family's privacy depended on staying quiet about what they'd seen. He described one night in particular, the week after Elizabeth's funeral, when a small van had arrived at the service entrance well past midnight, and 2 men he didn't recognize had loaded crates of what he later realized were her personal effects: letters, a few framed photographs from the children's hospital visits, a battered leather diary she'd kept since her wedding year. He'd asked the next morning where the boxes had gone. He was told, politely but firmly, that it wasn't his concern, and that continuing to ask would not be good for his position. Simon had kept his silence for years out of fear. But fear, he told her, eventually gets outweighed by conscience, and his conscience had been getting heavier every year since, especially each time he watched Isabeth's grandchildren on television and realized how little of their grandmother's real story they'd ever been allowed to inherit. Eleonora thanked him and drove home with a very different understanding of what she was looking at. This wasn't the ordinary erosion of old paperwork. It was intentional. It had a purpose, quietly reshaping Isabeth from a woman whose compassion had made the monarchy uncomfortable into a minor, faintly tragic footnote, someone the family had endured rather than someone the family had been shaped by. She wasn't going to let that stand. But testimony from one elderly man, however sincere, wouldn't be enough on its own. She needed something a skeptical public and a defensive family couldn't wave away. The proof, when she finally found it, was sitting in a groundskeeper's cottage on the edge of the old royal estate at Brenlow, in a case that hadn't been opened in almost 20 years. Walter Higgs had worked in the Palace Records Office until his retirement in 2007. Like Simon, he'd carried his own version of the same knowledge, and he'd done something Simon hadn't. He'd kept receipts. When Eleonora arrived at his cottage on a wet evening in early winter, he didn't waste time on pleasantries. He'd clearly been waiting for this visit for longer than the 6 months Eleonora had spent building toward it, perhaps for years. In the low, patient way that people wait for something they've stopped expecting will actually arrive. He led her down to a small cellar room, dry despite the weather outside, lined with shelves of gardening tools and old paint tins that seemed designed to make the room look uninteresting to anyone who wandered in by accident. Behind a loose shelf panel was the case. He opened it without ceremony. Inside were photocopies wrapped carefully against the damp retrieval logs, dated internal memoranda, itemized lists of materials removed from the archive, along with instructions for their disposal. Documents that didn't just suggest a pattern. They proved a decision made by a specific person at a specific time and carried out through a clear chain of instructions that ran from a single office all the way down to the men who'd loaded that van outside the service entrance. There was also a small recorder, the old cassette kind, that Walter had used once, years earlier. During a meeting, he'd grown suspicious enough about to record without permission. He'd kept the tape ever since, waiting for a moment when it might matter. Eleonora played it in the car outside his cottage before she'd even left the gravel drive. A woman's voice, clipped and certain, giving an instruction that left no room for interpretation. Everything connected to Isabeth was to be removed: letters, photographs, anything that might keep her present in the public imagination. No exceptions. This was an order, not a suggestion. It was, unmistakably, Marguerite's voice, recorded years before she'd become queen consort. Eleonora sat in her car in the rain for a long moment before she started the engine. She had spent 6 months hoping she was wrong about the shape of what she was uncovering. Now, she had proof that she wasn't. The question was no longer whether she had enough. It was how and when to use it in a way that couldn't be quietly buried a second time. Marguerite had not been oblivious to the fact that something was moving beneath the surface of the palace that winter. Her instincts, honed over 2 decades in royal life, told her Eleonora was digging. She didn't know exactly how far the digging had gone, but she understood enough to act. Her response was fast and thorough. Within 48 hours of sensing the threat, she'd ordered a final cleanup of any remaining digital archive material that might connect back to Isabeth or to the years of quiet removals. It was clean work, no loose threads in the current systems, nothing that could be easily traced. She also made sure a few carefully worded messages reached former staff she suspected Eleonora might approach, gentle reminders, delivered through intermediaries, that comfortable retirements could become considerably less comfortable if old stories resurfaced. And she prepared a fallback narrative if anything ever did surface. Responsibility would be quietly redirected toward a long-departed administrator who had died several years earlier and could no longer object to being blamed. It was a competent operation. It was also, in the end, entirely beside the point because everything Marguerite was scrubbing from the palace's current systems had already been sitting untouched for 2 decades in a cottage on the Brenlow estate, in a case that nobody in her circle even knew existed. The family convened privately 3 weeks after Rosalind's birthday. No press, no public record, just the king, Tobias, Marguerite, and Eleonora in a closed room. Eleonora placed her folder on the table without preamble and played the recording. Marguerite's own voice, 20 years younger, filled the silence, giving the instruction she'd clearly hoped would never be traced back to her. Her composure famous, total. Practiced over decades, did not survive the sound of her own words. She tried briefly to reframe it, a misunderstanding, an attempt to protect the family from painful publicity, an order taken out of context by people who hadn't understood what she'd really meant. She said she had only ever been trying to help the family move forward. She said everyone in the room was overreacting to an old recording that told only part of a much longer story. But Eleonora had spent 6 months closing every gap that a reframing would need in order to work. She laid the retrieval logs on the table one at a time, matching dates to the recording, matching signatures to instructions, until the version of events Marguerite was reaching for simply had nowhere left to stand. There was no ambiguous administrator to blame, because the documents named the office the instruction had come from directly. There was no reasonable misunderstanding to point to, because the instruction on the tape was explicit down to the phrase, "Leave nothing." One by one, every exit Marguerite tried closed before she could reach it. Tobias, who had said almost nothing since the meeting began, finally spoke. His voice was quieter than anyone expected. He asked his stepmother, simply, why? Not how, not when why. Marguerite didn't have an answer that survived being spoken aloud in that room, and after a long silence, she stopped trying to give one. The king listened without interrupting. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, the voice of a man absorbing something that reshaped his understanding of the last 20 years of his own family's history. He said simply that this had gone too far and that it would need to be addressed privately to protect the institution, but seriously and permanently. Marguerite's public duties were quietly suspended. The staff who had carried out her instructions were reassigned. The woman who had spent 2 decades trying to remove Elizabeth from the family's story had, in the end, removed herself from an active role in that family through the choices she'd made 2 decades earlier. Eleonora stood at the window after the room emptied, watching the garden below, feeling not triumph, but a complicated, exhausted relief. She hadn't done any of this for satisfaction. She'd done it because she'd promised herself, somewhere in the middle of those 6 quiet months, that Elizabeth's story deserved to survive intact, not managed, not softened, not quietly filed away as an uncomfortable chapter best skipped over. Tobias joined her at the window and told her what she already knew, that she'd been right, and that it had cost more than either of them would have liked. Sometimes, she said, the only way forward is straight through what was buried. Somewhere else in the castle, Rosalind was turning her grandmother's tiara over in her hands, too young yet to understand everything that had happened around her 12th birthday, but old enough to sense that she'd been given something more than jewelry. Her mother found her sitting by the nursery window, the tiara balanced carefully on the sill beside her, watching the last of the daylight catch on the stones. Great Aunt Eleonora said grandmother would be proud of me, Rosalind said, not quite as a question. But I never even met her. Her mother sat down beside her and said that meeting someone and knowing them weren't always the same thing, that Rosalind would spend years learning who her grandmother had actually been, in pieces, through old films and old letters and old friends who were still willing to talk, and that every piece would make the whole picture a little more hers. Rosalind would grow into the whole story, eventually not the trimmed, careful version someone had spent years trying to build, but the real one, with everything difficult and everything remarkable left intact. She would learn about the hospital wards and the refugee camps, about the years the tabloids had mocked her grandmother for caring too visibly about people who weren't supposed to matter to a queen. She would learn, eventually, about the 6 quiet months it had taken to make sure that story survived at all. That was what Eleonora had actually placed in that green leather case. Not a crown, not a headline. Permission for a 12-year-old girl to someday know exactly who her grandmother had been, in full, and to decide for herself what to do with the parts of that spirit she'd inherited. Epilogue. Why some stories refuse to disappear. Marguerite had understood something that turns out to be true far beyond any one family. It's very hard.